Welcome to this channel, where we dive deep into the most fascinating and transformative moments in history. Today, we're exploring one of the most significant yet often overlooked events in English history, the Peasants Revolt of 1381. What began as a desperate response to social injustice and economic hardship would go on to shape the future of political power, class relations, and the very nature of authority. In this video, we'll examine the causes, the key figures like Wat Tyler, and the far-reaching consequences of this revolt that forever altered the course of England's history. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not only what happened, but why it still matters today. So sit back, relax, and let's uncover the story of the Peasants' Revolt. Language played a crucial role. English, rather than Latin or French, increasingly became the language of everyday communication and moral debate. This shift was already underway, but the revolt accelerated it by highlighting the importance of communication among the masses. When people articulated grievances, they did so in the language of common life, reinforcing a sense of shared identity. The revolt also challenged elite assumptions about cultural superiority. Peasants demonstrated not only physical courage, but rhetorical skill. Their arguments were grounded in moral logic and social experience. This challenged the idea that wisdom and authority belonged exclusively to the educated elite. Cultural change did not occur overnight, but the revolt marked a turning point. It expanded the boundaries of who could speak, whose experiences mattered, and what kinds of stories deserved attention. In this sense, 1381 was not only a political event, but a cultural rupture that reshaped how society understood itself. Before the late 14th century, most peasants identified primarily with their village, lord, or parish. The Peasants' Revolt transformed this local identity into something broader. As people from different regions marched together, shared grievances, and coordinated action, a new sense of solidarity emerged. This was not modern class consciousness, but it was an important precursor. The revolt helped peasants recognize that their suffering was not isolated or accidental. It was systemic. Similar conditions existed across regions: heavy labor obligations, unfair taxation, legal inequality. Recognizing these shared experiences allowed people to see themselves as part of a larger social group. This emerging identity was shaped by action. Participation in marches, meetings, and negotiations fostered trust and cooperation. Even those who did not actively rebel were influenced by the atmosphere of collective defiance. The idea that ordinary people could act together became embedded in social memory. After the revolt's suppression, this identity did not disappear. It adapted. Open rebellion gave way to quieter forms of solidarity, shared resistance to obligations, mutual support, and collective negotiation. These practices sustained a sense of community beyond local boundaries. Importantly, this identity challenged feudal ideology. Feudalism relied on fragmentation, keeping peasants divided and dependent. The revolt demonstrated the power of unity. Even in defeat, the experience of collective identity weakened the ideological foundations of hierarchy. Thus, the Peasants' Revolt contributed to the slow formation of class awareness. It laid groundwork for later social movements by showing that identity could be built around shared interests rather than inherited status. Cultural memory plays a vital role in shaping societies, and the memory of the Peasants' Revolt cast a long shadow over English history. Official accounts sought to erase or distort the revolt, but popular memory preserved alternative narratives. These memories influenced attitudes toward authority, justice, and resistance for generations. The revolt became a cautionary tale for elites and a source of inspiration for the oppressed. Its lessons were ambiguous. Rebellion was dangerous, but submission was not inevitable. This ambiguity made the memory powerful and enduring. Over time, references to 1381 appeared indirectly in literature, folklore, and political discourse. Even when not named, its themes, abuse of power, collective action, moral justice, resurfaced repeatedly. The revolt became part of a broader cultural tradition of questioning authority. This memory also influenced how later generations interpreted social conflict. It provided historical precedent for resistance and shaped expectations about what rulers owed their subjects. In this way, cultural memory became a form of social inheritance. The endurance of this memory underscores the revolt's significance. Events matter not only because of what happens during them, but because of how they are remembered. The Peasants' Revolt lived on not through institutions, but through stories, attitudes, and identity. Thus, 1381 became more than a historical moment. It became a cultural reference point. It helped redefine who mattered in history and whose voices could be heard. Its legacy persisted quietly, shaping English society long after the last rebel was punished. The Peasants' Revolt occurred during a period of significant intellectual transition in England. Medieval thought was slowly shifting away from rigid scholasticism toward a greater engagement with lived experience, vernacular language, and moral complexity. Universities, religious institutions, and courts remained dominated by elites, but ideas increasingly circulated beyond these spaces. The revolt accelerated this transformation by forcing intellectuals to confront social reality. Inequality, exploitation, and unrest could no longer be ignored as abstract issues. They were immediate, visible, and dangerous. Intellectual life began to reflect a growing awareness of social tension. Writers and thinkers grappled with questions of order and justice. Was hierarchy divinely ordained, or was it maintained through human institutions that could fail? Could obedience be moral if authority was corrupt? These questions did not always receive explicit answers, but they shaped discourse. The increased use of English in writing was particularly significant. Latin and French had long dominated intellectual expression, reinforcing elite control. The gradual turn toward English reflected a broader social shift. Ideas were now more accessible, and writers increasingly addressed audiences beyond the aristocracy. The revolt thus influenced intellectual life not by dictating conclusions, but by reshaping concerns. It expanded the range of acceptable questions and made social inequality a subject of reflection rather than assumption. Thought became more grounded in human experience. This intellectual awakening did not immediately challenge authority, but it softened its ideological foundations. When thinkers begin to question why society is ordered as it is, change becomes possible, even if delayed. Literature offered a space where the tensions revealed by the Peasants' Revolt could be explored indirectly. Writers rarely described the revolt openly, given the dangers of criticizing authority. Instead, they addressed themes of justice, corruption, and social hypocrisy through allegory, satire, and character portrayal. Poetry and narrative increasingly depicted a world where moral worth did not align neatly with social rank. Common people were portrayed as wise, honest, or virtuous, while elites were often shown as greedy or corrupt. These portrayals subtly undermined feudal assumptions. Writers also explored the instability of fortune, the idea that power and wealth were temporary challenge beliefs in permanent hierarchy. This theme resonated deeply in a society that had witnessed peasants confront kings and nobles flee crowds. Satire became a powerful tool. By mocking corruption and hypocrisy, writers expressed criticism without explicit rebellion. Humor and irony allowed social commentary to circulate more safely. reaching audiences who recognized their own experiences in the text. Literature, thus, became a mirror reflecting social change. It did not incite revolt, but it preserved questions raised by it. Readers were encouraged to think critically about authority and morality. This indirect engagement with social conflict shows how cultural expression can absorb and transform historical events. The Peasants' Revolt influenced literature not as a subject, but as a catalyst that broadened its moral scope. The relationship between knowledge and power was subtly altered by the events of 1381. Traditionally, knowledge had served authority by justifying hierarchy. After the revolt, this relationship became more complex. Knowledge increasingly questioned, as well as reinforced power. Education remained restricted, but ideas circulated through informal networks, sermons, storytelling, and conversation. These channels spread moral reasoning that challenged injustice. Knowledge became less centralized. The revolt demonstrated that ignorance was not the cause of unrest. On the contrary, peasants showed awareness of law, economics, and ethics. This challenged elite assumptions about intellectual superiority. Over time, this recognition influenced cultural attitudes. Ordinary people were increasingly seen as capable of judgment and moral reasoning. This shift did not grant power, but it undermined stereotypes that justified exclusion. The long-term cultural impact of 1381 lay in this subtle revaluation of human worth. Authority could no longer claim exclusive access to truth or morality. While inequality persisted, its ideological justification weakened. Thus, the Peasants' Revolt contributed to a slow democratization of thought. It did not create equality, but it expanded the intellectual space in which equality could be imagined. Before the Peasants' Revolt, law in England was deeply shaped by status. Justice was not blind, it was hierarchical. Nobles enjoyed privileges, clergy were often tried in ecclesiastical courts, and peasants faced manorial systems designed to protect lordly interests. For ordinary people, law was less a shield than a burden. Manorial courts regulated nearly every aspect of peasant life: labor obligations, marriage permissions, inheritance, and movement. Fines were frequent and arbitrary, often imposed to generate income rather than uphold justice. Appeals were limited and outcomes were predictable. This experience fostered a widespread belief that law served power rather than fairness. The revolt emerged from this legal frustration as much as from economic hardship. Peasants were not lawless, they were legally conscious. They understood custom, precedent, and obligation. Their anger stemmed from the abuse of law, not its absence. During the revolt, rebels attacked legal symbols, courts, records, charters, because these represented institutional injustice. Burning documents was not mere destruction. It was an attempt to erase the legal foundations of exploitation. This act reflected a radical insight. Power was sustained through paperwork as much as through force. The revolt thus exposed a deep contradiction. Law claimed to represent order and justice, yet it perpetuated inequality. By challenging legal institutions, peasants questioned the moral legitimacy of the entire system. This was one of the most revolutionary aspects of 1381. Although repression followed, the revolt permanently altered perceptions of law. It revealed that legal systems could be unjust and that obedience was not synonymous with morality. This realization would shape later attitudes toward authority and justice. One of the most striking features of the Peasants' Revolt was its language. Rebels spoke not only of hardship, but of freedom. They demanded release from bondage, fair rents, and the right to work freely. These demands were framed in moral and customary terms rather than abstract ideology. Peasants appealed to ancient custom, arguing that excessive obligations violated traditional rights. This strategy grounded resistance in legitimacy. They were not seeking chaos, but restoration of fairness as they understood it. The demand for freedom challenged the legal basis of serfdom. While elites viewed unfreedom as natural, peasants increasingly saw it as imposed and unjust. This shift in perception was crucial. Once bondage was seen as wrong rather than inevitable, its legitimacy weakened. The revolt also challenged laws like the Statute of Laborers, which restricted wages and mobility. Peasants experienced such laws as state-sanctioned exploitation. Resistance to these statutes reflected a growing belief that law should protect labor rather than control it. Although demands were rejected, the language of rights endured. Peasants continued to invoke fairness, custom, and obligation in disputes. This legal consciousness contributed to gradual change. Over time, rigid enforcement of unfreedom became less sustainable. The revolt thus marked a moment when ordinary people articulated a moral vision of law, one grounded in justice rather than authority. This vision would not be realized quickly, but it reshaped expectations. The immediate legal aftermath of the revolt was harsh. Courts punished rebels, revoked charters, and reaffirmed hierarchy. Yet beneath this repression, subtle change unfolded. The legal system could not return entirely to its previous form. Landlords became more cautious in using courts to extract labor. Excessive punishment risked resistance or desertion. Over time, legal enforcement softened in practice, even if statutes remained unchanged. Peasants increasingly used legal mechanisms to defend interests. Lawsuits, petitions, and negotiations became tools of survival. Although success was limited, participation itself marked change. Ordinary people engaged the legal system as actors rather than passive subjects. This engagement gradually reshaped justice. Customary rights gained importance, and cash rents replaced labor services. While law did not become equal, it became more flexible. The revolt also influenced how justice was discussed. Moral arguments entered legal discourse. Authorities increasingly justified decisions in terms of stability and fairness, not just power. This rhetorical shift mattered. Thus, the Peasants' Revolt contributed to the long evolution of English law. It exposed injustice, challenged legitimacy, and forced adaptation. Law remained unequal, but it was no longer unquestioned. 1381 was a legal as well as social turning point. It marked the beginning of a slow transformation in how justice was imagined and contested. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 forced medieval England to confront a fundamental political problem: the nature and limits of authority. Before the revolt, authority was largely understood as absolute and hierarchical. Kings ruled by divine sanction, nobles governed by inherited right, and peasants obeyed because obedience was considered both natural and moral. The revolt shattered the certainty of this worldview. When thousands of ordinary people openly defied officials, ignored royal commands, and forced negotiations, they demonstrated that authority depended on acceptance as much as force. The ruling elite could punish rebellion, but could not prevent it entirely. This realization marked a turning point in political understanding. Authority, once imagined as fixed, now appeared conditional. If rulers failed to govern justly, obedience could weaken. The rebels' insistence that corrupt officials, not kingship itself, were responsible for injustice reflected an emerging distinction between legitimate and illegitimate power. This distinction was politically significant. Even though elites rejected rebel arguments, they absorbed the lesson. Authority required justification. Excessive coercion risked instability. As a result, rulers increasingly emphasized law, tradition, and common good to legitimize decisions. This shift did not democratize England, but it altered political expectations. Power was no longer entirely unquestionable. It could be judged, criticized, and resisted, at least in extreme circumstances. Thus, the revolt contributed to a slow transformation in political thought. Authority remained dominant, but its foundations were shaken. Governance became less about unquestioned command and more about maintaining consent, however limited. Although the Peasants' Revolt was not a constitutional movement in the modern sense, it introduced ideas closely related to consent. Rebels argued that laws and obligations should reflect fairness and custom rather than arbitrary imposition. This emphasis on custom functioned as a form of popular consent. In medieval England, custom carried moral weight. Practices repeated over generations were seen as legitimate. When new taxes or labor laws violated these expectations, they appeared unjust. The revolt was, in part, a defense of customary rights against imposed authority. This language of custom echoed earlier political traditions, such as those expressed in Magna Carta, which had asserted that the king was subject to law. Although peasants were excluded from its protections, its principles influenced broader political culture. The idea that power must respect established rights resonated deeply. The revolt extended this principle downward. Peasants claimed that their labor and lives could not be governed solely by elite decision. While they did not demand representation, they demanded recognition. This emphasis on consent reshaped political dialogue. Rulers became more cautious in introducing reforms without consultation, at least among elites. While peasants remained excluded, the idea that governance required some degree of acceptance became embedded in political culture. Thus, 1381 contributed indirectly to the evolution of constitutional thought. It expanded the concept of political legitimacy beyond mere force, grounding it in tradition, justice, and communal expectation. The long-term political significance of the Peasants' Revolt lies in how it reshaped ideas of accountability. Before 1381, accountability flowed downward. Peasants were accountable to lords, and lords to the king. After the revolt, however, the possibility of upward accountability, however limited, entered political imagination. Rulers learned that policies had consequences beyond obedience. Governance required attention to social conditions. Taxation, labor control, and legal enforcement were no longer purely technical matters. They were political risks. This realization influenced later developments in English governance. Over centuries, mechanisms of accountability expanded through parliament, law, and political tradition. The revolt did not cause these changes, but it contributed to the environment in which they became possible. The revolt also demonstrated that political ideas could emerge outside elite circles. Ordinary people articulated concepts of justice, consent, and obligation grounded in experience. This challenged assumptions about who could think politically. The Peasants' Revolt represents an early chapter in a long history of popular political consciousness. It reminds us that ideas of accountability did not emerge suddenly in modern times, but evolved through struggle. Although the rebels were defeated, their challenge to absolute authority endured. It weakened the ideological certainty of feudal power and planted the seeds of later demands for responsibility and restraint. Thus, 1381 stands as a moment when authority was forced to justify itself. That moment would echo through English political history for centuries. While the immediate consequences of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 were harsh repression and the restoration of feudal norms, the social and ideological impact of the uprising had longer-lasting effects on English society. The revolt catalyzed a fundamental shift in social consciousness. particularly regarding the ideas of equality and justice. Before the revolt, feudal England was characterized by rigid social hierarchies. The nobility ruled over peasants with little question or challenge. The revolt, however, sowed the seeds of a new social awareness. Peasants, though still largely illiterate and excluded from political power, began to see themselves not just as subjects of lords, but as active participants in shaping the course of society. The demands raised during the revolt, particularly the call for the abolition of serfdom and the right to fair treatment before the law, introduced ideas of equality that would have long-lasting effects. Even though the revolt was suppressed, the very fact that ordinary people had articulated such demands, based on principles of justice and fairness, introduced a new political lexicon. This shift in social consciousness was not immediately transformative, but laid the foundation for future social movements. The language of equality, however imperfectly understood at the time, would gradually be used in later generations to challenge not only feudal structures, but also the political and economic systems that arose in the subsequent centuries. In the decades following 1381, many English peasants would continue to advocate for better conditions, though without the same level of collective action seen during the revolt. Nonetheless, the revolt's challenge to the feudal hierarchy left a lasting impression. The question of whether it was just for the nobility to maintain such unchecked power would continue to surface in political discourse, particularly during later movements for political reform and civil rights. The social consequences of the Peasants' Revolt were not just ideological, but also economic. One of the most significant, though gradual, effects of the revolt was the eventual decline of serfdom in England. Although the immediate aftermath saw the reinstatement of many feudal rights and obligations, the revolt itself accelerated existing economic shifts that would eventually undermine the system of serfdom. The Black Death of the 1340s had already caused a dramatic reduction in the population, leading to a severe labor shortage. This demographic shift gave surviving peasants greater bargaining power. In the decades that followed, the feudal economy increasingly shifted toward a system based on wage labor rather than compulsory servitude. Following the revolt, while feudal lords attempted to enforce labor services and restrictive laws, they faced growing resistance. The peasants who had participated in the revolt were not easily subdued and, in many cases, continued to demand fair wages and better working conditions. Landowners began to recognize that laborers could no longer be coerced into working without their consent. By the end of the 15th century, much of the rural economy in England had moved away from the rigid structure of serfdom. Although serfdom technically remained in some areas, it had become less common, and many peasants enjoyed greater freedom of movement and economic independence. Cash rents began to replace labor services, providing peasants with the opportunity to work as wage laborers or tenant farmers. The decline of serfdom, however, was not a result of a single event, but rather a combination of economic pressures, social unrest, and changing agricultural practices. The Peasants' Revolt was a significant catalyst in this process, forcing lords and the monarchy to adapt to the new realities of labor and economics. While the revolt was not solely responsible for the eventual dismantling of serfdom, it undeniably contributed to the ideological and social shifts that made the system less sustainable. Though the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 did not immediately result in widespread political reform, its legacy can be seen in the social and political movements that followed in England. Over the centuries, the revolt would inspire future generations to challenge authority, demand rights, and advocate for equality. One of the most direct outcomes of the revolt's ideological impact was the rise of Lollardy in the 15th century. The Lollards, followers of John Wycliffe, were influenced by the revolt's emphasis on social justice, moral authority, and the critique of corruption within the church and the nobility. Wycliffe's radical theological ideas, such as the rejection of the church's temporal power and the belief in the primacy of Scripture, found a sympathetic audience among the lower classes. While the Lollards were primarily concerned with religious reform, their critique of hierarchical structures echoed the social demands of the peasants in 1381. The revolt's ideological influence also extended into the English Civil War of the 17th century, when ideas of popular sovereignty and resistance to tyranny resurfaced. The English Civil War would later see the rise of political groups like the Levelers, who argued for broader democratic participation and the equal rights of all citizens. The Levelers' radical democratic ideals can be traced back to the spirit of defiance and justice articulated in the Peasants Revolt. In the 19th century, the revolt's influence extended even further, as it became a symbol for social movements pushing for workers' rights, universal suffrage, and the end of class-based oppression. The revolt's legacy in challenging the status quo and advocating for the rights of ordinary people helped shape the labor movements and political reforms of the industrial age. Thus, while the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was suppressed and its immediate demands rejected, its influence endured through a long arc of history. The revolt's call for justice, fairness, and equality provided the ideological groundwork for future movements that would continue to challenge the power structures that had dominated England for centuries. The revolt was not a single, isolated event, but part of a broader, ongoing struggle for political and social rights that shaped the course of English history. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 revealed critical vulnerabilities in the English monarchy, particularly in terms of the king's relationship with both his subjects and his advisors. At the time of the revolt, King Richard II, a mere 14 years old, was unable to effectively govern on his own, leading to the rise of regents and advisors whose actions were often seen as self-serving and disconnected from the realities of common people's lives. The revolt exposed the fragility of royal authority, as the rebels were able to march on London with little initial resistance. They took control of key sites in the city, and for a brief period, Richard was forced to negotiate with them, offering concessions like the promise of the abolition of serfdom. However, the king's lack of direct involvement in the leadership of the rebellion ultimately showed the limits of his power. Despite being the figurehead of the state, Richard had little control over the unfolding events, and his inability to assert real leadership led many to question the efficacy of his rule. In the immediate aftermath of the revolt, Richard's advisors moved quickly to suppress the rebellion, employing brutal tactics to punish the rebels and restore order. However, this did not resolve the deeper issues of legitimacy and trust. The king's personal authority remained suspect in the eyes of many, particularly the lower classes, who had experienced firsthand the consequences of royal neglect and the excesses of the feudal system. This weakening of royal authority had profound implications for the future of English monarchy. It marked the beginning of a longer process in which monarchs could no longer assume unquestioned loyalty from their subjects. The revolt, although unsuccessful in achieving its demands, led to a rethinking of how monarchy could function in relation to its people, particularly in terms of maintaining the consent of the governed. The challenges to Richard II's rule foreshadowed the struggles for power that would play out throughout the rest of his reign, leading to his eventual deposition in 1399. The revolt's impact on royal authority highlighted the emerging need for a more sophisticated relationship between the monarchy and its subjects, one that involved more than just the exercise of force. While Richard would go on to rule for several more years, the lasting effect of the revolt was a realization that monarchs could no longer govern effectively without accounting for the grievances and aspirations of common people. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 also marked the beginning of a gradual shift in the relationship between the monarchy and its subjects, especially the common people. Prior to the revolt, monarchs often ruled with a near absolute sense of authority, relying on the feudal system to maintain order and collect taxes. However, the revolt exposed significant flaws in the monarchy's reliance on the feudal system as a means of governance. The peasants' demands for justice, equality, and the end of serfdom challenged the idea that the monarchy could simply uphold traditional feudal obligations. The revolt brought to light the reality that the people, particularly the lower classes, were increasingly disillusioned with a system that perpetuated their poverty and powerlessness. The king's promise to abolish serfdom, although quickly rescinded, was a signal of the growing tension between monarchy and the feudal order. In the aftermath of the revolt, Richard II and future monarchs had to grapple with the implications of the demands made by the rebels. For the monarchy to survive in the long term, it needed to adapt to a new social reality in which the strict hierarchies of the feudal system were being questioned. The increasing reliance on wage labor, the decline of serfdom, and the growth of towns and cities meant that the traditional relationship between king and subject was changing. This shift signified that the monarchy could no longer depend solely on the feudal system to govern, but would have to find ways to engage with the growing class of free laborers and the urban bourgeoisie. While the monarchy did not immediately shift its policies, the revolt's call for reform echoed through the later medieval period. The idea that the king had a duty to protect the welfare of all his subjects began to take hold. This shift in the monarch's role, although gradual, eventually contributed to the development of the English constitutional monarchy. The recognition that the king could not rule without the support of the people would later become an essential feature of English governance, particularly during the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The revolt's influence on royal power was not merely about the immediate political changes it triggered, but about the long-term evolution of monarchy. The revolt introduced the idea that the monarch's power had limits, and that those limits were defined by the consent of the governed. This evolving relationship between king and subject would have far-reaching effects on England's political structure in the centuries that followed. Although the Peasants Revolt of 1381 failed to achieve its immediate objectives, its legacy lived on in the gradual transformation of English political and social structures. In the years following the revolt, several reforms were enacted that sought to address some of the underlying grievances that had sparked the uprising. However, these reforms were often piecemeal and were frequently reversed as the monarchy sought to regain control. In the wake of the revolt, one of the key political changes was the eventual decline of feudalism. The economic pressures of the period, coupled with the labor shortage caused by the Black Death, led to a shift toward a more market-based economy. Lords, unable to rely on serf labor, began to adopt wage labor systems and cash rents, which gradually eroded the feudal system. This process, while not directly caused by the revolt, was certainly accelerated by it. The peasants' demands for better working conditions and fairer rents resonated with the growing trend of labor rights and the decline of serfdom. The revolt also had a lasting impact on the relationship between the monarchy and parliament. The rebels had demanded not just economic reforms, but also political changes, such as the reduction of the king's power over the commons. While these demands were not fully realized, the idea that the monarchy needed to work with other political bodies to govern became increasingly important. Over time, this would contribute to the development of the English Parliament as a more powerful institution. Moreover, the revolt helped to catalyze the rise of popular political thought. While the immediate repression of the rebellion silenced open revolt, the ideas that the rebels had voiced, that kings had a duty to serve the common good, and that the lower classes were entitled to justice, remained in the cultural memory of the people. These ideas would be taken up again in later political movements, including the English Civil War and the eventual rise of constitutional monarchy. The social and political shifts caused by the Peasants' Revolt were not immediate, nor were they always smooth, but they marked the beginning of a process that would eventually transform the structure of English governance and society. The revolt's legacy was not only in its challenges to the existing system, but in how it reshaped the future trajectory of monarchy, law, and class relations in England. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 left an indelible mark on English political thought, particularly in the way authority was conceptualized. Prior to the revolt, authority in medieval England was largely defined by a deeply ingrained feudal hierarchy, where power flowed from the crown to the nobility and ultimately to the peasants. Authority was not only exercised through laws and decrees, but was also reinforced by moral and religious justification, with monarchs seen as divinely appointed rulers. However, the revolt shattered the assumption that authority was a natural, unquestionable force. The challenge posed by the peasants, who demanded justice and fairness, revealed the vulnerability of the monarch to public dissent. While the revolt was suppressed, its ideological impact was profound. It exposed a critical shift in the way authority could be challenged, demonstrating that power was not entirely absolute and could be contested, especially if it was perceived as unjust. One of the most significant changes that emerged was the understanding of legitimacy. Before 1381, it was largely assumed that the monarchy's power was legitimate by divine right. This notion was reinforced by the Church, which played a central role in justifying the political order. Yet, after the revolt, the idea of legitimacy became more closely tied to the perceived fairness of the monarch's rule. The revolt demonstrated that if the crown's policies were seen as exploitative or harmful to the common people, its authority could be directly challenged, even if this challenge did not result in immediate success. This shift in the understanding of authority laid the groundwork for future political movements. It was no longer enough for a ruler to claim divine right or noble lineage. Their ability to maintain the consent of the governed, at least in certain circumstances, became a critical component of their rule. This change was gradual, but it marked the beginning of a redefinition of political authority, one that emphasized the moral and ethical responsibility of rulers toward their subjects. In the centuries that followed, this idea would resonate through the political upheavals of England, from the English Civil War to the Glorious Revolution, where issues of consent, governance, and the balance of power between the monarchy and the people would come to the forefront. The Peasants' Revolt contributed to the slow erosion of the divine right of kings and the development of a more participatory form of governance, one that considered the interests of common people more seriously. One of the central demands of the rebels during the Peasants' Revolt was the recognition of legal rights and social justice for the common people. The idea that peasants could have the same legal rights as nobles was revolutionary, especially in a time when the feudal system was built on rigid class distinctions. The revolt's leaders framed their demands not as a desire for equality with the elite, but as a call for the king and the legal system to acknowledge their inherent rights and dignity. Though these demands were not immediately met, the revolt planted the seeds for future developments in legal and social reforms. Over time, the notion that common people were entitled to legal protection against arbitrary power would become increasingly accepted. This shift would be critical in the development of common law, which gradually emerged as a more standardized and universally applied system of justice. In the aftermath of the revolt, there was a growing recognition that the law could be a tool for social change, not just a means of reinforcing existing hierarchies. The idea that people had rights, whether they were peasants or town dwellers, began to take root. Over the next few centuries, this would lead to reforms that gradually eroded the privileges of the nobility and the clergy, contributing to the slow emergence of a more egalitarian society. By the late medieval and early modern periods, the legal system began to be more accessible to common people. The idea of universal justice, or at least justice that could not be so easily manipulated by wealth or status, gained ground. This was not the immediate result of the Peasants' Revolt, but the revolt set a precedent for later movements that would demand legal equality. Furthermore, the challenge to feudal laws and the increasing recognition of commoners' grievances would be integral to the rise of parliamentary sovereignty. The idea that the law must reflect the will and interests of the people, and not just those in power, would be central to the formation of more representative forms of government, as seen in the development of parliament in the centuries following the revolt. The Peasants' Revolt, despite its failure, had a significant impact on the development of political ideologies in England and beyond. The revolt helped to foster an early discourse on the rights of common people, the limitations of absolute power, and the necessity of governance that respected the common good. These ideas would resonate through the political developments of the early modern period. The revolt did not introduce political ideologies in the modern sense, but it played a critical role in creating the intellectual environment that would give rise to movements advocating for greater political participation and the redistribution of power. The idea that ordinary people could have a say in governance, and that their grievances should be addressed, set the stage for the later emergence of democratic principles. The English Civil War of the 17th century, which saw the monarchy clash with Parliament, would echo many of the themes raised during the revolt, including questions of consent, accountability, and the legitimacy of royal authority. The Levelers, a radical political movement during the English Civil War, called for the extension of voting rights and equality before the law, ideas that had been foreshadowed by the demands of the 1381 rebels. Moreover, the Peasants' Revolt contributed to the rise of social contract theory, the idea that legitimate government is based on an agreement between the rulers and the ruled. While figures like John Locke would formalize these ideas in the 17th century, the seeds of the concept were already present in the revolt. The peasants' call for fair treatment from the monarchy implied a belief in the contract between monarch and subject, and that a ruler's authority rested not solely on divine right, but on the consent of the governed. Thus, although the Peasants' Revolt was suppressed, its ideological and political impact was profound. It reshaped the way later generations would think about justice, governance, and the role of the common people in shaping their own political destiny. The revolt laid the groundwork for the democratic and constitutional developments that would gradually unfold over the centuries. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 represents not just a singular episode of social unrest, but a crucial moment in the broader evolution of political and social consciousness. In many ways, it was an eruption of the pressures that had been mounting over the previous decades. Economic hardship, the breakdown of feudal systems, and the alienation of the lower classes from those in power. However, the historical importance of the revolt lies in its aftermath and the political reverberations that echoed through the centuries. The revolt's ideological legacy was significant, as it forced both the monarchy and society at large to reconsider the role of the ruler, the rights of the people, and the boundaries of authority. Although the rebellion was quickly suppressed, it had planted the seeds for later political movements that would continue to call for justice, equality, and the protection of rights. Even in its failure, the revolt redefined what was considered politically possible, and it reshaped the language of political discourse for future generations. The revolt demonstrated the power of collective action and made clear that political change could come from the people, not just from the king or the elite. For the first time in English history, common people demanded political accountability, articulated moral and legal arguments, and questioned the existing social order. The idea that ordinary men and women could demand rights, not just submit to the will of the powerful, became part of the historical imagination in England. Moreover, while the revolt's specific demands, such as the abolition of serfdom, were not realized at that time, the ideological push against feudal exploitation remained embedded in the national consciousness. The revolt can be seen as an early step in the ongoing struggle for political and social reform in England, contributing to the long process of democratization and the eventual development of more inclusive forms of government, as seen in the constitutional changes of the 17th century. The significance of the Peasants' Revolt extends beyond its immediate aftermath, touching on the gradual redefinition of political power in England. The events of 1381 laid the groundwork for later conceptualizations of popular sovereignty and legal reforms that would shape the trajectory of English governance. While the revolt did not immediately result in widespread constitutional change, it initiated the process of questioning the divine right of kings and the absolute authority of the nobility. By challenging royal authority, the peasants unwittingly introduced the idea that power could be contested on moral and legal grounds. This challenge helped pave the way for the development of common law as a more unified and accessible system of justice. The growing idea that the law should serve not only the elite, but also the common people contributed to the later shift in English legal thought. Although the monarchy regained its authority after the revolt, the notion that legal systems could be used to protect the rights of all classes began to take root. The revolt also planted the seeds for later parliamentary reforms. In the centuries following 1381, English monarchs found it increasingly difficult to govern without involving Parliament, as the calls for justice from commoners had given rise to new ideas about accountability. The evolution of parliamentary sovereignty would eventually transform the political landscape, allowing for more inclusive representation and limiting the power of the monarchy. By demanding the king's attention and pushing for reforms, the peasants of 1381 set in motion the idea that sovereignty ultimately rested with the people, not just the crown. This notion would not fully take shape until the English Civil War in the 17th century. But the roots of popular sovereignty can be traced back to the ideas and actions that emerged from the revolt. Moreover, the legal reforms that followed the revolt, including changes in the enforcement of serfdom and labor laws, were significant as they gradually allowed for greater freedom and mobility for the common people. While feudal structures did not vanish immediately, the legal environment was forever altered, as the English monarchy had learned that it could not easily impose economic or social control without considering the will of the people. The long-term influence of the Peasants' Revolt can also be seen in the development of later political movements that sought greater power for common people. While the revolt did not directly lead to democratic reforms, it laid the foundation for later struggles for political rights, universal suffrage, and a representation of working-class interests. The principles of justice and equality raised in 1381 would resonate throughout later social movements, including the labor movements of the 19th century and the Chartist movement in the 1830s and 1840s. In the centuries following the revolt, the role of the monarchy in English politics gradually shifted. While absolute monarchy remained the norm for much of the early modern period, the ideological challenge to royal authority set in motion a process of political change that would culminate in the development of constitutional monarchy. By the 17th century, England saw the rise of parliamentary democracy, where the power of the monarchy was increasingly limited by the rise of Parliament and the rule of law. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, which resulted in the overthrow of King James II and the establishment of William and Mary as constitutional monarchs, represented the triumph of the principles that were implicitly suggested by the revolt. The Bill of Rights of 1689 limited royal power and confirmed the supremacy of Parliament, marking the end of absolute monarchy in England. The long path from the Peasants' Revolt to the establishment of constitutional monarchy shows the enduring power of the ideas articulated by the rebels. Additionally, the development of human rights and the rule of law, which emerged in the aftermath of the revolt, would eventually influence social reforms throughout the Western world. The revolt helped pave the way for the larger recognition of the rights of individuals and the responsibility of governments to uphold justice. Thus, the Peasants Revolt of 1381, while not immediately successful in its demands, contributed to a longer and ongoing historical trajectory in which the power of rulers was challenged, and the rights of common people were more systematically addressed. Its place in the history of political change is not defined by the success of its immediate goals, but by the long-term ideological and social shifts it helped to catalyze, influencing not just England, but the broader development of democratic ideas and practices worldwide. And there you have it, the full story of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 and its lasting impact on English society. The moral of this story is clear. Power, though seemingly absolute, is never unchallengeable, and even in the face of defeat, ordinary people can change the course of history. The ideas of justice, equality, and accountability that the rebels fought for paved the way for future political movements and reforms. This revolt, though crushed, left behind a legacy that continues to inspire struggles for rights and freedoms across the world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to subscribe to this history channel for more incredible stories that shape the world we live in today. Don't forget to like, comment, and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our next historical exploration. See you next time as we uncover even more fascinating chapters from the past.